People often misunderstand what it means to be an empath. They imagine someone who is endlessly kind, endlessly forgiving, someone who absorbs pain without complaint. From the outside, that can look like emotional weakness, but if you look more closely, you'll see something very different. An empath isn't someone who feels too much because they lack strength. They feel deeply because they refuse to disconnect from their humanity. And that choice to remain emotionally open in a world that often rewards emotional distance requires extraordinary courage. The tragedy is that this very openness makes them vulnerable to people who mistake compassion for permission. An empath will often offer second chances, then third, and sometimes far more than either deserves. Not because they cannot recognize hurt, but because they believe people can grow. They hold on to potential even when reality repeatedly disappoints them. They don't simply hear apologies, they search for sincerity behind the words. They don't just see mistakes, they imagine the wounded person beneath them. Psychologically, this reflects something profound. Human beings are wired to preserve meaningful relationships, even when those relationships become painful. An empath simply carries this instinct to a greater depth. They don't ask, "How do I protect myself?" as quickly as they ask, "What happened to this person that made them act this way?" That question is beautiful because it reflects emotional intelligence, but it also becomes dangerous when understanding begins to replace accountability. This is where emotional erosion begins, not through one dramatic betrayal, but through hundreds of quiet compromises. Every time an empath silences their own disappointment to preserve someone else's comfort, something shifts internally. Every time they convince themselves that this will be the last time, while knowing deep down it probably won't be, they move a little further away from themselves. The outside world rarely notices this process because empaths don't usually announce their suffering. They continue showing up. They continue listening. They continue giving reassurance while privately wondering why no one notices that they too are exhausted. They become experts at carrying emotional weight that was never entirely theirs to carry. Philosophically, this raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does compassion stop being a virtue and start becoming self-abandonment? There is a profound difference between loving someone through their struggles and sacrificing your own emotional well-being to maintain an illusion of peace. Many empaths discover this distinction far later than they wish they had, because generosity can quietly disguise the loss of personal boundaries. Relationships are not sustained by love alone. They survive through reciprocity. They require moments where both people become caretakers, where vulnerability flows in both directions. When one person consistently becomes the emotional container while the other simply empties themselves into the relationship, the balance inevitably collapses. No human being, regardless of how compassionate they are, possesses an infinite emotional reserve. Perhaps the greatest misconception is believing that an empath doesn't notice the imbalance. They notice everything. They recognize the changed tone of voice, the delayed response, the subtle withdrawal, the promises that slowly lose their meaning. Their sensitivity allows them to detect emotional patterns long before others do. The reason they stay isn't ignorance. It's hope. Hope that honesty will return. Hope that effort will become mutual. Hope that the person they first believed in still exists beneath the disappointments. But hope has limits. Eventually, the emotional debt becomes impossible to ignore. The cost of constantly understanding everyone else while feeling increasingly unseen begins to outweigh the comfort of staying. And by the time that realization fully settles, something essential has already changed inside them. The first consequence of breaking an empath isn't that they stop loving others. It's that they slowly stop believing their own heart deserves the same care they've spent a lifetime giving away. And that is where every irreversible transformation quietly begins. What surprises many people is that an empath rarely reaches their breaking point in a single dramatic moment. There is usually no explosive argument, no unforgettable betrayal that suddenly changes everything. The transformation is quieter than that. It happens through accumulation. One disappointment becomes another. One broken promise quietly joins 100 others. One evening of feeling unseen blends into months, sometimes years, of emotional imbalance. Eventually, the empath doesn't wake up angry. They wake up clear. Clarity is often mistaken for coldness, but they are not the same thing. Anger still seeks engagement. It still hopes the other person will understand, apologize, or change. Clarity asks for none of those things. It simply recognizes reality without trying to negotiate with it. For an empath, this is one of the most difficult psychological shifts they will ever experience because it requires letting go of the story they have been telling themselves about what the relationship could become. Human beings don't suffer only because of what is happening. They also suffer because of what they continue expecting to happen. We become attached not only to people, but to possibilities. We invest in imagined futures. We convince ourselves that if we are patient enough, loving enough, understanding enough, eventually the relationship will reflect the effort we've poured into it. But relationships cannot be built on potential alone. They must be built on participation. This is the painful lesson the empath eventually learns. For so long, they have believed that understanding another person's pain would naturally inspire change. They thought that if someone truly felt seen, they would become more honest, more present, more willing to reciprocate. Sometimes that happens, but sometimes compassion simply makes it easier for someone to avoid accountability because they know they will continue to be forgiven. There comes a moment when the empath realizes they have been carrying both sides of the emotional conversation. They have been interpreting silence, excusing inconsistency, translating mixed signals into hopeful meanings. And then, one day, they stop translating. They begin accepting actions at face value instead of rewriting them into something easier to live with. That shift changes everything. Notice that they don't become less compassionate. They simply redirect that compassion. Instead of asking, "Why are they treating me this way?" they begin asking, "Why have I accepted treatment that continually diminishes my peace?" That is not selfishness. It is emotional maturity. Healthy boundaries often emerge after repeated experiences of having none. An empath who once believed that love meant endless availability begins to understand that genuine love also requires self-respect. They discover that saying no is not an act of rejection. Walking away is not an act of cruelty. Refusing to carry another person's emotional responsibilities is not a failure of kindness. It is a recognition that every healthy relationship depends on mutual effort. This is why the empath's withdrawal often confuses people. Those who benefited from their endless patience mistake the silence for indifference. In reality, it is exhaustion giving way to wisdom. The conversations stop because they have already been repeated countless times. The explanations disappear because they no longer believe explanation alone creates transformation. They stop chasing not because they care less, but because they finally understand that care without reciprocity becomes emotional depletion. Perhaps the deepest change is internal. The empath begins trusting themselves again. They no longer need constant reassurance that their feelings are valid. They stop apologizing for having needs. They recognize that protecting their emotional well-being is not something they must earn through suffering. It is something they are inherently worthy of. This is where resilience quietly takes the place of survival. The empath no longer measures love by how much pain they can endure. They measure it by the degree of honesty, safety, and mutual growth it creates. That single shift changes every relationship that follows, because it changes the relationship they have with themselves first. And once an empath discovers that peace is more valuable than chasing what refuses to meet them halfway, they don't simply leave a relationship behind. They leave behind the version of themselves that believed self-sacrifice was the price of being loved. And this is where the story takes a turn that many people never expect. There is a common belief that the greatest consequence of hurting an empath is the guilt they might feel afterward or the anger they may eventually express. But those are temporary emotions. The real consequence is far quieter and far more permanent. It is their absence. Absence has a way of revealing value that presence often conceals. As long as someone is consistently available, consistently understanding, consistently willing to repair what others have damaged, their contribution can become invisible. Human beings adapt remarkably quickly to emotional generosity. We begin to treat extraordinary care as though it were ordinary. We stop noticing the person who remembers every important conversation, who senses distress before it is spoken, who creates emotional safety simply by being present. It is only when that presence disappears that its significance becomes unmistakable. The irony is that an empath rarely leaves with dramatic declarations. They do not usually seek revenge or attempt to make someone suffer in return. Their departure is often marked by silence rather than conflict. They simply stop investing where their investment has repeatedly gone unanswered. They stop knocking on doors that have remained closed for too long. For the person left behind, this silence can become deeply unsettling. Not because they suddenly lose an argument, but because they lose the emotional certainty they had quietly depended upon. The messages become less frequent, the reassurance disappears, the patient explanations no longer arrive. The emotional space that once absorbed misunderstandings is suddenly gone, and they are left to experience the full weight of their own choices without someone constantly softening the impact. Psychologically, this reflects an important truth about human attachment. We often underestimate what consistently supports us because stability feels ordinary. We notice disruption more than reliability. We grieve what we assumed would always remain available. This is why people sometimes recognize the depth of another person's value only after they have lost access to it. But while one person begins confronting absence, the empath begins discovering something entirely different. Healing is often misunderstood as returning to who you once were. In reality, healing changes you. The empath who emerges after deep emotional disappointment is not identical to the one who first entered the relationship. They are gentler with themselves, more discerning with their trust, less interested in being chosen by everyone, and more committed to choosing environments where mutual respect already exists. This transformation is not about becoming emotionally distant. It is about becoming emotionally intentional. They still possess compassion, but it is no longer unconditional. They still believe in forgiveness, but they no longer confuse forgiveness with continued access. They still care deeply, but they understand that caring for someone else should never require abandoning themselves. There is profound wisdom in this shift because it redefines strength. Many people believe strength means enduring more, tolerating more, sacrificing more. Yet genuine emotional strength often looks exactly the opposite. It is the courage to leave situations that continually diminish your spirit. It is the discipline to stop confusing familiarity with love. It is the confidence to accept temporary loneliness instead of permanent emotional depletion. And perhaps this is the lesson every relationship quietly teaches us. The people who enter our lives are not only mirrors reflecting who we are. They are also opportunities to discover how we value ourselves. Every boundary we establish, every standard we uphold, every moment we choose honesty over comfort shapes the quality of the connections we create. So if you have an empath in your life, don't mistake their patience for permanence. Don't assume that because they understand your flaws, they will forever absorb the consequences of them. Appreciation delayed too long often becomes appreciation that arrives after the opportunity has already passed. And if you recognize yourself in this story, if you have spent years believing that love meant carrying burdens that were never yours to bear, remember this: your greatest gift has never been your willingness to endure pain. It has always been your capacity to create connection. Protect that gift with the same devotion you once reserved only for others. Because the most powerful empath is not the one who sacrifices themselves to keep everyone else comfortable. The most powerful empath is the one who finally understands that the deepest act of compassion is refusing to disappear from their own life.